I'm going to invite our three panelists to come back to the front, and we are ready to take questions and comments from the audience. We have two portable microphones on each on two sides. So raise your hand if you have a question or something to say, and we'll get the microphone to you.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations. They were great. And my question is for Cliff. As I was hearing your presentation, I couldn't help to think about what other sort of practices could be like meditation, but not meditation specifically, that could sort of perhaps produce the same results. So I'm thinking a lot of deep prayer and sort of the importance of religion in people's lives, and whether engaging in prayer, or people that are highly religious and perhaps do prayer, whether we might see some of these same effects.
I think that's a really important question, and I think that one may want to ask, what exactly is meditation? And there is a concept of prayerfulness that is kind of being put forward analogously to mindfulness. For this particular project, the folks who are highly dedicated to this kind of change your life around entirely and go do a 3-month retreat, they have, for the most part, a Buddhist religious worldview. And the ethical frame that is, and the commitments to compassion and a life of, in some level, service that often are put forward in religious, many Judeo-Christian traditions, actually come into play here. So we're not just looking at an entirely secular context where you're doing a divorced practice. There's an explicit ethical frame. It's in a Buddhist retreat center. The teacher has a Tibetan Buddhist outlook, has translated many texts, and would cite liturgical sources, scriptural sources, as part of the information when people asked questions. So in this particular research project, these influences are already at play. And I think that it's increasingly important to pay attention to the context, the practice context, and to all of the implicit and explicit values. So I think many kinds of prayer will have similar outcomes, but the features that really reflect the cognitive training of bringing the mind back to an object again and again, well, this is often part of many different religious practices, right? There's a religious contemplative thread in all major religions. So there's something about mind training in addition to the religious and cultural frame and the distributed values and community. And all of these things are present when you sit down to meditate.
Okay, hi. This is sorry. At least I can see you. This is a question, it came up during Alison's talk, and it had to do with this practice that many of us do for sometimes hours a day, staring at Facebook feeds or other news feeds, and this idea of liking things, which implies both a positive frame and a type of sharing, but often what one likes is something that's quite violently framed, in which case one adds a negative emotion on top of it. I hate this, here it is, folks, to which all of one's friends then like. So I'm wondering, on the one hand, does this, or have you kind of considered what that kind of sharing, good news, bad news, how that works as a kind of daily practice? And then with regard to the way that Cliff ended his talk, is there also something going on in which the meaning of liking is being undone or made into something other. In this case, perhaps the opposite way in which sadness was being the meaning of sadness was being kind of transformed toward compassion. Here, liking is being transformed into some type of participation in the kind of general media negative frame that Amber was discussing.
It's really interesting. So I think there was that scandal over the Facebook experiment, right, where they were looking at if you actually, they were manipulating what people were getting in their newsfeed, the valence of it, and then showed that the valence propagates itself, which we kind of already knew in the social sciences, but oh my gosh, it happens on Facebook. So if you see negative stuff, and I think the negatives were stickier in that study too, right? If you see negative stuff, then you're more likely to share negative stuff yourself, and if you see positive stuff from your friends, you're more likely to share positive stuff, and we might predict that the negative stuff would be more far-reaching and would have a longer-lasting impact, although I don't think they looked at that. The question so the question of what do we share is a really interesting one. One of my graduate students is interested in looking at whether we expect, like actually testing the question of whether we expect sharing bad news to make us feel better than sharing good news with other people, or just kind of daily minor negative events versus daily minor positive events, but whether the reverse might be true. And there's some pieces out there in the literature to suggest that that might be the case. So people tend to expect that, they think, if I've just talked about something that happened to me that was bad, I think I'm processing emotionally better now than I was before, but if you actually look at how they feel, they're not feeling any better. And there's also research showing that, right, we tend to rely on our friends and think that we're getting a lot of social support from our friends when they support us when we're having bad things happen to us, but what really predicts psychological well-being is when we have friends and family who support us when good things happen to us. And a critical part of the boost that we get from having those friends that will listen to us when good things happen, which is called capitalization rather than support. One of the key features of capitalization that makes it so good is the validation you get from other people. So it's not enough that I tell you this great thing happened to me or my paper got accepted. I also need you to say back, that's amazing, congratulations, that's great. And so I wonder if part of what likes are doing on Facebook is it's not so much a valence of this is good or this is bad, but it's just I hear you and I agree with your perspective and I'm sharing in this reality that you're putting out there. Yeah.
For Dr. Peña, you said that violent video games don't necessarily lead the players to aggression, but I'm wondering if there's any research on whether it leads to a lack of empathy or how those players then perceive sadness or violence in the real world.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think I need to tone down perhaps that claim. I think that the more reasonable claim based on the evidence is that you see an increase in aggressive thoughts and emotions and behaviors after exposure. But the question of whether they translate into the long term into aggressive behavior in society, it's still out there in the open. I mean, think about it for a moment. If you watch a horror movie, it would be surprising for you to run an experiment and find that people are thinking about blood and gore right after the experiment. Probably wouldn't be that surprising. So I think that the key issue there is that it seems that in controlled laboratory settings we can find some evidence that would imply that something is happening to our cognition, emotion, and behaviors in context. The question is whether that actually meaningfully translates into violence in the real world. I'm talking about a school shooting or something like that. Chris Ferguson would make the assumption that if we were to see as much violence that is commensurate to the amount of video games that people are playing, then would be at war. There would be like some sort of violence epidemic, but doesn't seem to be the case. Now, that being said, some of the evidence would show that among certain populations, kids that come from households in which their parents are divorced, for example, or coming from more problematic backgrounds, and with certain traits, that the content of video games may have a stronger effect on some of us, but not all. So again, a combination between who you are and what you consume. On that particular regard, many of the studies, more to your question, would show a pattern that is, I think, closer to what you're asking. Do we see reductions in pro-social behavior after playing a violent video game, for example? And there's some really interesting studies done by Brad Bushman at Ohio State University. For example, he would have people play violent video games, and then a mock fight would break out outside of the laboratory. So you would hear like banging, and there's something going on, and they would measure how long it took for people to go out and break out the fight. And the people that were playing violent video games took about 1 minute longer for them to go and aid and break out the fight in comparison to ones that were playing violent video games. But still it's a question of whether that desensitization actually translates more into desensitization to violence out there in the real world. Probably yes, for some people, understand the context. That being said, one little aside there, there's some recent studies that would show that some of the antisocial effects of video games are less about the content and it's about how much time you're actually spending. If you're spending the 20 hours that Cliff mentioned or more, then it could be like way too long. That can have a deleterious effect on you. But if you're playing a violent video game for shorter, then it could be okay. So it's not only about content, but for how long are you stuck actually playing the game.
First and then.
Hi, those were great papers. Thank you all so much. This question is about mindfulness meditation, and as you know, mindfulness is having a moment, right? In terms of corporate interests, schools, the media, publishing, etc. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. In American Studies, one of the questions that we often ask is, why this, why now? And thinking beyond sort of the intrinsic benefit of the practice or even the science that's showing its benefit, can you talk a little bit about why you think this moment is happening now? What are some of the conditions, social and cultural and contextual, that are leading to this?
So can I go back to my PowerPoint? I tricked you all. I had an epilogue which was exactly on this, but I put the thank you to make you think that I actually ended my talk there, but I didn't. I actually have some slides about the answer to this question, if I can show them. Can I do that?
It'll just take a minute. It's still there, so I just need to redo it.
So here's the epilogue. So this is a chart of the increase in the number of publications relating to mindfulness by year, and you see an exponential increase. But there's also in society, this moment is actually one that's being orchestrated by media moguls at some level. You have a reporter for Nightline, Dan Harris, and you have Arianna Huffington. And there's been an awful lot of press, in part as a function of the interactions between scientists and the Dalai Lama and the Mind and Life meetings. And this is one of these things that's been slowly growing, but we've gotten to a point where the hype is really way ahead of the data. And in fact, there's not much room left, but we're having a conference at the Center for Mind and Brain. Our research summit this year is on the complex role of scientific research in mindfulness, perception of mindfulness. So we have Time magazine, and we have the cover of Scientific American, and just last week in the most impactful journal in all of neuroscience with an impact factor of 31, we have an article by Y.Y. Tang, Britta Holzel, Michael Posner about the neuroscience of mindfulness in Nature Neuroscience Reviews. But a lot of the content of that article focuses on the incredibly hard challenges of this research, inconsistent results, and problems that are not part of what is the press. But we also have things like this. So I'm in this article: to make a killing on Wall Street, start meditating. Our visual perceptual threshold data from our sustained attention task is of interest to the reporter of this article because guys on Wall Street want to be able to extract maximum information per screen So they can do a kind of brain hacking to make more money. It's a kind of internal high-frequency trading. And of course, talk about perception as reality. We have the best dressed monk attire for the mindful man. So those are my extra slides. So, you know, the why now is Davos, and I mean, it's not surprising that given the latency, this rapid rise, and the notion that if you communicate research findings to people who have their hand on the tiller of the culture through media, you will see it. I don't know if it equals a storm, but it's a little squall.
Hi, I have a question for Jorge. One thing that was interesting to me at the end when you were talking about the Minecraft thing with either helping someone renovate or versus destroying, a lot of ways kids play with Minecraft is through these servers where they have their friends or people they don't know who are playing with them. So there's virtual other avatars that they're either cooperating with or stealing from or destroying things of. And how do you think that works where it's instead of like most of the studies at least you were talking about is a single person in these kinds of games? What do you think the potential is for looking at how groups work together or dyads work together, and would that translate into anything outside in the real world?
Okay, many layers there. Right, many of our studies are looking at just people playing individually, and as you mentioned, many people would actually play with others, and they can build some wonderful things. If there are any Game of Thrones geeks here in the audience, I imagine one or two like myself, you would know that people recreated all of that virtual land within Minecraft, and that's not only one person, it's the collective effort of many others. That being said, in some of the studies that we've carried out, we had people, for example, be collaborating to try to escape out of a desert island. This was a collaboration with Portuguese computer scientists, and we built this platform that looked a little bit like a video game, and half of our participants got avatars that did not have any cues for a common social identity, and half of our participants used avatars that had the UC Davis colors. And you can imagine how that went in terms of collaboration, identification with their avatars, and so on. So some of these principles, at least based on some of our preliminary findings, this idea that you can use avatars in a way that you center people's identity in a virtual environment in a particular way, but that also affects the collective in terms of whether they're more willing or less willing to cooperate. We're borrowing a little bit from the idea that we are activating social identity based on the cues that are embedded in the appearance of your avatars. In another recent study, we recreated a virtual library in Second Life, and we asked participants to meet for the first time, and we took care of them never seeing each other for the first time, and we put them in this virtual library or in a virtual cafe that had some of the elements of wood, that was a little bit warm, and the interpersonal dynamics in terms of getting to know you process. We asked them like, hey, converse for 15 minutes, get to know each other, was affected by the environment in which it happened. There was more self-disclosure in the context of the virtual cafe in comparison to the library, and the perceptions of the partners' warmth were also increased in the virtual cafe in comparison to the virtual library. But your question, I think, is more about virtual communities, and I think that my research at the highest level of what I study would be small groups. But there's some really interesting research in terms of, for example, my colleague Cindy Shen has some work that shows that the role that you take in a virtual environment, like, for example, a video game, would determine how many friends you make and how much social capital you build within the game. It is different to be a caster, like you're like in the background, in comparison to being in the front line, being a little bit more of, I don't know, a tank, as it's called, someone that goes on the attack. So indeed, connected to your question, the roles that people take on the virtual environment may determine the type of social capital outcomes more in comparison to who they are in terms of their personality. Many times some of these outcomes depend on how we play as well. Thanks.
Hi, I have two questions, if that's okay. One is for Dr. Saron. Have anybody looked into the long-term effects of meditation on people who've had chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia? Because there's been long-term negative effects towards the brain, like tiny holes or stress exposure.
So there have been a number of studies looking at fibromyalgia and some meta-analyses of those that show mindfulness-based stress reduction has been helpful for fibromyalgia. I don't know of research on CFS. I would assume people are also looking at that. So mindfulness-based stress reduction actually is a multimodal intervention of 8 weeks, about 27 hours of material, homework, a week retreat, a day-long retreat, and group support. And there are studies that show that many of the effects on well-being of the format of the 8-week training, if you keep everything else the same and don't emphasize mindfulness particularly, also show benefits. So this gets to this question of generalizability of many aspects of paying attention and caring for oneself can already put yourself in a positive position. But there are aspects of pain, lowering the suffering quotient for strong painful sensation that is actually thought to work in mindfulness, and it's part of this de-reification process where you see your catastrophizing thoughts as less real and hence less determinative of future outcomes. And that's part of why mindfulness-based cognitive therapy helps to clinically prevent depression relapse, because people's depressive rumination can be reframed as not being representative of future reality or current reality. So that's first question, yeah.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Peña, I had a question about the way women are shown and treated in video games. Sorry.
Sure.
And how it affects the players.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's some really interesting studies by Jesse Fox, different person again. The famous actor I just mentioned. She's at Ohio State University. She has some really interesting studies in which she had women use over-sexualized avatars or not, and then she measured objectification, self-objectification, and she would show that these virtual experiences, particularly when women were using over-sexualized avatars, that had an effect on their self-perceptions and not necessarily a positive one in terms of using these scantily clad avatars. I have not done empirical work in the area, but I can answer perhaps with an empirical anecdote, which is close enough. One of the activities that I have in one of my classes, video games and virtual environments, is that I ask undergrad students to content analyze the reviews of video games that are available online, see who's the main character, the secondary character, the level of violence, sexualization, etc. And then we read the literature in terms of the underrepresentation of women and ethnic minorities as well, particularly African American and Latinos, or Hispanics, in the context of video games. And the findings were pretty much what you can expect. That being said, some of the reactions from the students were a little bit surprising to me, because they basically, even though they empirically analyzed the findings and we run the statistics for them, and like the eyes have it, like this is what you collected, this is what you found, they would still say that I was drinking the Kool-Aid, that I was repeating this idea in the media that women are being harassed online and that they are underrepresented in video games. So to answer with an anecdote there, it is interesting how many times, as we know, information does not change people's perceptions. And for many of the students, this was an eye-opening moment in which, like, okay, now I see it. Indeed, there's issues of representation in video games. But even I can mention that there's a small hardcore group of students that didn't quite have an effect. And I would get like 2 a.m. emails in the morning, like saying, like, you're not teaching this right, or students claiming in class that this has always been the case, should be the case, and so on, which is a very problematic position to take, especially when you're teaching a class with 200 students. Everybody was like looking at the students like, what are you saying? So indeed, it has an effect, and the work of Jesse Fox would imply that it affects the way that people perceive themselves, and also it might be hard to change some of those perceptions among gamers, among certain gamers at least.
Okay, I think it's about time for lunch. Let's thank our three panelists for sharing with us their very interesting and inspiring research, and I hope you enjoy your lunch and the rest of the conference.